They laughed when he pulled up, but they weren't laughing for long. If you've ever been underestimated because of how you look or where you come from, stay right here. This story will strike a chord deep inside you, and when it does, I want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the moments that matter most. Now let's begin. The sun was barely above the horizon when an old rust-streaked pickup truck rolled onto the private runway at Westlake International Airport. Inside the luxurious terminal, a wall of tinted glass separated two worlds, one polished and cold, filled with tailored suits and practiced smirks. The other raw and uninvited, embodied by Marcus Jennings. He stepped out of the truck wearing a faded blue jumpsuit and boots stained with years of grease. His hands, scarred from engines and exhaust, carried a dented red toolbox with the name M. Jennings barely visible under the grime. Laughter floated through the glass like smoke from a fire someone hoped to hide, but Marcus didn't flinch. "Is this the expert they called?" scoffed Richard Hastings, director of operations at Evans Aerospace. "I thought we requested the best technician, not someone who looks like he belongs at a junkyard." Marcus heard it, loud and clear, but he'd heard worse. Words were easy to ignore when you'd spent a lifetime surviving them. He just kept walking, his eyes fixed on the gleaming silver jet that awaited his hands. They didn't know that those same hands had built systems their top engineers couldn't replicate. They didn't know that this mechanic, had once designed the very blueprint, flying half the aircraft in their fleet. But none of that mattered now. Not the awards, not the degrees, not the patents, only the job. The runway supervisor kept a careful distance, like standing too close might stain his pristine shirt. "Mrs. Evans's jet takes off in 2 hours. Our guys couldn't figure out what's wrong. If you can't fix it, Atlanta's team will take over." Marcus didn't answer. He simply nodded once, eyes scanning the aircraft like a surgeon before an operation. Through the terminal glass, a dozen eyes followed his every move. Mocking, doubting, silently asking what's he doing here, but one pair of eyes didn't look away. They weren't mocking, they weren't doubting. They were watching. Intently, curiously, almost intrigued. And then her voice cut through the morning silence like thunder. "Let him work." Heads turned, and the story began. Marcus turned toward the voice, strong, commanding, and clear. She walked across the tarmac with the kind of stride that made people move without question. Her heels clicked with intention, her navy blue pantsuit unwrinkled, her expression unreadable. Alexandra Evans, CEO of Evans Aerospace. The woman behind the jet he was about to fix. She didn't spare a glance for the gaggle of executives now pretending not to stare. She looked only at Marcus. "How much time do you need?" she asked without preamble. "It depends on the problem, ma'am," Marcus replied, locking eyes with her. There was a brief pause, a silent measuring of character. Then she checked her watch, a sleek platinum piece that probably cost more than Marcus's entire garage. "You have 1 hour," she said. "Impress me. No further instructions, no threats, no warnings, just one line that dared him to rise or fall." The executives turned and drifted back inside, shaking their heads, dismissing the moment like a scene beneath their concern. But Marcus wasn't there for them. He was there for the machine. And possibly for the first time in years for something more. As the heat shimmered off the tarmac, Marcus approached the $65 million Gulfstream G650, its silver skin glowing like a trophy. To others, it was a status symbol. To him, it was a puzzle, a breathing, whispering system of pressure wires and precision. He ran his hand gently across the fuselage and opened the main access panel. Within seconds, his trained eyes spotted the mistake, a disaster hiding in plain sight. The previous team had misdiagnosed the issue as a trivial electrical fault. In truth, the jet's pressurization system was on the brink of catastrophic failure. At cruising altitude, the cabin would have depressurized in minutes. Everyone on board would have died, and they'd have called it mechanical error. Filed away, forgotten. His pulse steady, Marcus got to work. Each movement was precise like clockwork, wound by years of experience and raw necessity. This wasn't just about fixing a jet, this was about preventing a funeral. Or 10. Through the hangar glass, Alexandra stood motionless, eyes locked on him. not hovering, not interrupting, just watching. There was something in her gaze that didn't match the others, not arrogance, not suspicion, something else. Recognition, curiosity. It was hard to say. 38 minutes later, the job was done. No applause, no camera crew, just a man with dirty hands wiping sweat from his brow and folding his tools back into an old red box. He didn't wait for thanks. He rarely got them. For people like Marcus, doing the impossible was expected but never celebrated. The world had taught him that long ago. He turned to leave until a shadow crossed his path. Alexandra Evans, alone this time, walked straight toward him. No entourage, no clipboard, no pretense. "How long would it have taken your predecessors to discover the real problem?" she asked, voice low and controlled. "They wouldn't have," Marcus said plainly. "The plane would have gone down first." A long silence followed. No gasps, no overreaction, just the weight of truth settling between them. Then, without breaking eye contact, she said two words that would change everything. "Come with me." And she turned, not waiting to see if he'd follow. Marcus picked up his toolbox and stepped into a future he never saw coming. The terminal swallowed them in polished silence. No one said a word as Alexandra led Marcus through corridors lined with glass, marble, and whispers. His boots echoed against the floor like reminders of a world that wasn't meant to be walked by men like him. Not here, not this deep into the temple of power. She didn't speak, didn't glance back. And yet something about her stride told him everything. This was not spontaneous. This was deliberate. They passed offices where men in $1,000 suits paused their conversations to gawk. Marcus could feel their stares like heat on his neck. But Alexandra kept walking unwavering. Finally, they stopped in front of a door. One unlike the others. Sleek, opaque, no nameplate. She opened it with her fingerprint and stepped inside. It was an office, but not just any office. This was where the real decisions were made. The kind of room most employees would never even know existed. The furniture was minimalist, but everything screamed wealth, silent, intentional wealth. The kind you didn't need to show off because it ran deep like roots in granite. She motioned toward a leather chair. "Sit." Marcus sat. Alexandra moved behind her desk, eyes locked onto him, as if trying to decode a language she wasn't sure he spoke. After a moment she asked, "Did you tell me your full name, Marcus Jennings?" Her fingers danced across her tablet. "SMJ," she murmured. A flicker of realization passed through her eyes, the initials engraved on the original G7 designs. Marcus said nothing, but his grip on the armrest tightened barely. Alexandra looked up. 3 patents, 4 innovation awards, a master's degree in aerospace engineering. And yet here you are, fixing jets in a jumpsuit. Marcus's voice didn't waver, because no one hires a black engineer from the suburbs to lead development teams. And mechanics pay bills, Ms. Evans. A flash of something crossed her face. Sympathy, number respect. She opened a drawer and slid a folder toward him. Inside, detailed documentation, development timelines, design credits, award ceremonies. All bearing the name Richard Hastings. "Do you know how much profit that system has brought my company?" she asked. "Roughly $428 million, Marcus answered. "It cut fuel consumption by 23% and maintenance costs by 31%. Alexandra blinked. "Richard received 3 promotions and a $2.5 million bonus for his work," she said evenly. "While Marcus began, continued fixing jets, she finished. The silence returned, thick and bitter. Then came a knock, sharp, urgent. The door opened without invitation. Richard Hastings strode in fake concern painted across his face like bad makeup. "Alexandra, the board is waiting for you on the call." And he stopped short when he saw Marcus. His mask cracked. "What is he still doing here?" Richard barked. "The service is complete, right?" "Actually," Alexandra said coolly, "we were discussing intellectual property, specifically the G7 system." Richard paled. "I don't understand what a mechanic has to contribute to this discussion." She turned the tablet toward him. "Because these are the original blueprints. Initialed MJ. Marcus Jennings." "That's absurd," Richard snapped, forcing a laugh. "He was just an assistant. The G7 system was developed entirely by my team." Another knock. This time, a middle-aged woman stepped in with a briefcase nearly as thick as Alexandra's. Dr. Sophia Chun Evans, Aerospace's chief legal officer, a name Marcus knew from company articles he used to read in the shadows. "Forgive my delay," Sophia said calmly. "I had to confirm the intellectual property logs." She turned to Hastings with ice in her voice. "And yes, I've verified everything. The digital signature belongs to Mr. Jennings, not you." Richard stumbled back a step. "There must be a mistake." "There's no mistake," Alexandra cut in. "In fact, I have emails here, your emails recommending Mr. Jennings' dismissal for technical incompetence exactly 3 days after he submitted the completed G7 design." Marcus sat silently watching the empire built on his silence begin to crack. 5 years ago, he'd been escorted out of the same building like a thief. Today, he was watching history correct itself one fact at a time. "Mr. Jennings," Alexandra said, her tone shifting from sharp to serious. "Dr. Chun has prepared documents I'd like you to review." Marcus didn't move. Not yet. He'd waited 5 years. For justice, he could afford a few more seconds to be sure it was real. "What kind of documents?" he asked evenly. "Retroactive recognition of your authorship," she answered. "Financial compensation for royalties owed. And a proposal." His eyes narrowed. "What kind of proposal? The kind that makes history." Richard Hastings's voice broke through before the moment could settle. "This is outrageous," he growled. "The board would never approve any of this." "Alexandra, you can't do this. You don't have the authority." "I will inform the board within the hour," Alexandra replied, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "And if you want to maintain a shred of dignity, I suggest you hand your badge to security before I call them myself." Richard's face twisted, caught somewhere between panic and fury. He looked at Marcus as if trying to burn a hole through him, but the mechanic didn't flinch. Not anymore. When the door slammed shut behind him, Alexandra turned to Sophia, then back to Marcus. "Now we can really begin." What followed over the next 2 hours wasn't just a legal consultation, it was a reckoning. Sophia unspooled documents, dates, internal memos, evidence that the G7 system was just the beginning. What no one outside the room could imagine was that Alexandra Evans had known for some time. She had been quietly investigating not just Hastings, but a culture of theft prejudice and silencing voices that dared to shine from the wrong zip code. "You weren't the first, Marcus," she said softly, "just the brightest, and the one who left undeniable proof." In her briefcase was a 2-year internal investigation, names, patterns, decisions that screamed institutional rot. Alexandra hadn't acted until now because she was waiting. For this moment, for this man. In the silence that followed, Marcus felt the anger he'd swallowed for years stir beneath the surface. But alongside it came something he hadn't expected: clarity. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because I need your help." She didn't sugarcoat it. She didn't plead. Just the truth laid bare. "Richard Hastings still holds sway over half the board," she continued. "He has friends in high places. I can't bring him down with conjecture. I need irrefutable proof." Marcus leaned back, his voice steady. "And what do I get in return?" "Everything that was stolen. Recognition, compensation, and—" She paused just briefly. "The position that should have been yours 5 years ago. Director of Innovation." Marcus couldn't help it. He laughed, not out of humor but disbelief. "Do you really think the board would accept a black mechanic in that role?" Alexandra smiled for the first time. "They won't have a choice once they see what's at stake." Sophia slid a confidentiality agreement across the desk. "This ensures everything discussed here stays between us until you're ready." The knock came again, and once again Richard Hastings barged in, brazen, desperate. "What is this?" he snapped. "Why is he still here?" Alexandra didn't look up from her tablet. "We're discussing the G7 system and intellectual theft." Richard froze. He saw the documents, the tablet screen. "Sophia, Marcus." He tried to recover. "You're wasting time. The board is waiting." "You don't really believe these conspiracy theories, do you?" Alexandra stood. "You are suspended pending the outcome of the internal investigation." "You can't do this," he roared. "The board will be notified in 1 hour." His hands trembled as he turned and left, slamming the door behind him. Alexandra exhaled. "We have 2 weeks until the shareholders' meeting." That's our window. Marcus looked up. I have something better than a window, he said. She blinked. What, I have the original prototype, digitally signed, with time-stamped development records. Sophia looked stunned. And more than that, Marcus added, I have recordings from 5 years ago of Hastings explaining exactly how he planned to erase my name from the company's records, word for word. Alexandra sat down slowly. How did you get that? Marcus's voice was calm, even, deadly. I grew up in a neighborhood where people like me don't get second chances, so I learned early, always carry insurance. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Marcus hadn't just documented his own case. For 5 years, while he repaired jets and swallowed his pride, he had quietly catalogued every stolen idea, every discarded name, every injustice buried under titles and bonuses. His jumpsuit had been a disguise, his silence a strategy, and now the reckoning had begun. 6 months later, Evans Aerospace no longer resembled the fortress of exclusion it once was. The executive floor, once a monochrome parade of suits that mirrored each other in race thought and arrogance, was now a symphony of color, talent, and stories once shut out. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. And that difference had a name: Marcus Jennings. He no longer walked into the building through a service entrance. He no longer carried a toolbox. Now he held keys, literal and metaphorical, to the future of aerospace innovation. Director of Technological Innovation, the title they once said someone like him could never earn. Not without breaking the unspoken laws of class and complexion, but now etched in gold beside his office door, it was undeniable. The extraordinary shareholders' meeting that had transformed everything would be remembered as a turning point not just for Evans Aerospace, but for the entire industry. Alexandra Evans had stepped on stage beside Marcus with Dr. Chun at her side and dropped a truth bomb the boardroom had never seen coming. They played the recordings. Hastings's voice crackled through the speakers, arrogant and unapologetic. We need to get rid of this pretentious mechanic. Take credit. Erase her authorship. No one would believe a black woman from the suburbs came up with something this advanced. The room fell into stunned silence. Then came the gasps, the murmurs, the red-faced denials from board members who had once praised Hastings without question. Stock prices fell 18% in a single day. But something greater rose in its place: trust. I could have sued Marcus, told Aviation Technology magazine in his first official interview. But this wasn't just about me. It was systemic, and I wasn't looking for revenge. I wanted visibility, accountability, change. The solution he and Alexandra proposed wasn't just bold, it was revolutionary. First, they launched a restitution program to identify and reward employees whose innovations had been quietly stolen or buried over the past 10 years. Next, they established the Evans Aerospace Innovation Fund, a $100 million initiative to support research, invention, and training in historically marginalized communities. Hastings, meanwhile, faced civil suits from former employees, intellectual property theft charges, and public disgrace. His engineering license was revoked. His consulting firm went bankrupt before it even launched. Recruiters wouldn't return his calls. The man who once laughed at a black mechanic on the runway couldn't even get a desk at a third-rate company. But Marcus wasn't thinking about Hastings anymore. He was focused on something bigger. 3 months into his new role, Alexandra had proposed something no one expected. Not a romantic proposal, though the tabloids spun it that way for weeks, but a business merger. I thought she was insane, Marcus admitted on Good Morning America. I was running a one-man company from my garage during those 5 years in exile. But she saw something more, and now that company owns 30% of Evans Aerospace's innovation division. Many former executives resigned. They couldn't stand to work under a woman and a black man who had exposed their silence. Others stayed. They learned. Not by choice at first, but eventually by example. And on the 1-year anniversary of the day Marcus saved that jet, Alexandra held a company-wide event. There, in front of every employee, she unveiled their next big breakthrough, a propulsion system engineered by Marcus's team that would reduce fuel consumption by 40%, a landmark achievement in aviation sustainability. She took the mic, A year ago, she said many of you watched a black man get mocked on this very tarmac while saving lives. Today, that same man is saving the planet, our industry, and something more important, hope. The applause thundered, but Marcus didn't bask in it. He looked out into the crowd and found the face he cared about most. His mother, Mrs. Jennings, 72, sat in the front row with tears in her eyes. The woman who scrubbed floors in office buildings her whole life so he could chase dreams others never thought he'd touch. He didn't smile for the board, or the cameras, or the accolades. He smiled for her, because this was her victory too. As the standing ovation slowly faded, Marcus took the stage. He didn't need a speechwriter. He didn't need a teleprompter. He had 5 years of silence stored in his chest, and today he was ready to release every word. He glanced once at Alexandra, then turned to face the crowd. Real change, he began, his voice calm but steady, doesn't happen when someone like me breaks through. It happens when we break the system that says I wasn't supposed to. He paused, letting the weight settle. Success isn't just about becoming the exception to the rule. It's about tearing the rulebook apart so the next generation doesn't have to fight this hard just to be seen. In the audience, dozens of young engineers nodded, some with tears in their eyes. Many of them were people of color, women, first-generation college students, people who had been told directly or silently that their seat at the table was conditional. Not anymore. For years, Marcus continued, my biggest dream wasn't glory. It wasn't a title. It wasn't revenge. It was this, that no child would have to shrink their brilliance to fit inside someone else's narrow expectations. He looked at his mother again. Her hand clutched a handkerchief, now soaked in tears. Pride tears, memory tears, the kind that water every sacrifice she had made. The greatest victory, Marcus said, is not the title on my office door. It's not the stock options or the press. It's this moment, looking into the eyes of the young people in our community center and seeing something I never had at their age. He smiled, voice breaking slightly. Freedom from doubt. After the applause, Alexandra stepped back on stage to make one final announcement. Inspired by Marcus's story, companies across the nation had reached out. They wanted to replicate the Evans aerospace transformation, not just for PR, but because it worked. Diversity wasn't just moral, it was profitable, it was sustainable, it was innovation. What started as a response to injustice became a movement. Other corporations began launching programs to locate and credit historically silenced inventors. A national registry of intellectual contributions was proposed in Congress, designed to ensure no one's brilliance would ever be buried again. But even as the world took notice, Marcus stayed rooted in one place, the Evans Aerospace-funded Community Technology Development Center, built in the very neighborhood where his journey began. There, surrounded by soldering irons, code boards, and recycled jet parts, he mentored the next wave of visionaries. Under his guidance, 3 patents had already been filed by students, one of them by a 17-year-old girl whose prototype for silent drone rotors stunned even veteran engineers. You know what's ironic, Alexandra said to Marcus one evening, watching those students build and dream. If Hastings had just shared credit, he'd still be director. Marcus chuckled. Greed makes people underestimate others, but it also blinds them to what they could have built together. And just when the world thought the story had reached its final chapter, it turned one last page. 3 months after Marcus signed on as a partner, Alexandra walked into his office with 2 mugs of coffee and a mischievous glint in her eyes. She placed a contract on the desk. It wasn't just a business proposal, it was a merger agreement. Not of hearts, not of lives, but of visions. Alexandra proposed merging her aerospace empire with Marcus's engineering company, a company he'd nurtured alone in a garage with borrowed tools and infinite hope. Not marriage, she laughed, preempting the tabloids, but a legacy, one we write together. That day, the ink dried on a partnership that changed the face of the industry forever. And in boardrooms across America, executives who once dismissed a black mechanic began studying the blueprint he left behind, not just for innovation, but for transformation. 1 year later, on a runway flooded with golden light and applause, the story came full circle. The hangar doors parted like a curtain, revealing the crown jewel of Evans Aerospace's newest chapter. A sleek, eco-efficient commercial jet powered by a propulsion system Marcus's team had spent 11 months perfecting. A marvel of sustainable engineering capable of reducing fuel consumption by 40% and designed not in secretive boardrooms, but in a lab surrounded by first-time inventors from overlooked neighborhoods. Alexandra stood beside Marcus again, but this time their roles were not just CEO and director, they were architects of a revolution. This aircraft, she announced, her voice echoing through the loudspeakers, is not just about aviation. It's about elevation of voices of minds of dreams long denied. The crowd erupted, but Marcus wasn't listening to the applause. He was listening to something else. He scanned the front row, where faces once turned away from him now sat upright, leaning forward. Executives who had once rolled their eyes when he walked in now hung on his every word. Some had changed, some hadn't, but all had been changed by the outcome. Among them sat a group of young engineers fresh out of the program he'd founded. Their smiles were unrestrained, their confidence intact. They were what he wished he could have been at their age, free. And in the center of it all, in a seat of honor, sat Mrs. Jennings. She wore a pale blue dress and carried the same handbag she'd taken to work for 30 years as a janitor. She had polished marble floors in buildings where people never looked her in the eye, just so her son could one day be seen. Now they all looked at him, tears shimmered in her eyes as Marcus took the microphone one last time. "I've been asked," he began, "how it feels to be the man who changed Evans Aerospace." He smiled, humble, grounded. "But I didn't change this company alone. I didn't dismantle a system on my own. I simply refused to accept that my value was determined by someone else's perception." He looked directly at the young engineers again. "You don't have to become a miracle to be recognized. You already are one. Don't let anyone treat your brilliance like a favor. The greatest injustice isn't being underestimated, it's being unseen." He paused. The silence was complete, reverent. The best answer to prejudice isn't proving them wrong, it's making sure no one else has to fight that hard, ever again. Alexandra reached for his hand, and for a moment there were no CEOs, no titles, no politics. Just two people who had refused to bend, who had chosen integrity over silence, justice over comfort. That moment, captured in 1,000 photographs, went viral not because of who they were, but because of what they stood for. In the weeks that followed, similar programs bloomed across industries. Funds were launched, patent audits were demanded. Inventors once buried beneath corporate credit lines were finally named. Marcus Jennings didn't just fix a jet, he repaired something bigger, something broken in the culture, in the system, in belief itself, and the world noticed. Because sometimes the greatest revolution begins with a single act of quiet excellence. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is show up, do the impossible, and never ask for permission to belong. The world had already crowned Marcus a symbol, but he was never interested in symbols. He was building systems, ones that outlast applause, outlive headlines, and outwork politics. While magazines called him the man who rewired the skies, Marcus quietly returned to where it all began, the Community Technology Development Center, a building once abandoned, now alive with spark circuits and dreams. Inside, a 14-year-old boy was programming drone flight paths. A teenage girl soldered components for a medical-grade air filtration unit she designed herself. And at the center of it all stood Marcus, no longer in a jumpsuit, but in rolled-up sleeves covered in grease anyway. He wasn't just mentoring, he was multiplying. Because that was the real endgame. Justice wasn't in punishing Hastings. That chapter had closed long ago. The man who once orchestrated an empire of erasure now sat alone, jobless, nameless, powerless. His name removed from the G7 patents, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale in corporate training slides. But Marcus's legacy, it was everywhere, in tech expos where teenage girls introduced game-changing innovations, in universities that cited his systems in case studies on ethics and equity, in boardrooms where silence was no longer an option. Even government officials took notice. A congressional committee reached out to Marcus for counsel on intellectual property reform. His recommendation, visibility is the first form of justice. Let's make it law. The ripple kept growing. Alexandra stood by his side through it all, not as the woman who gave him a chance, but as the woman who took one with him. Together, they didn't build a savior narrative. They built a blueprint. one that proved inclusion wasn't charity. Talent doesn't wear a uniform, and brilliance isn't limited by zip code or last name. It had been exactly 1 year and 8 months since Marcus stepped out of his truck that morning on the runway. Now he stood behind the podium at the dedication of a second innovation hub, this one named after his mother, the Louise Jennings Center for Applied Aerospace Ingenuity. She taught me, Marcus said, voice thick with emotion, that mopping floors didn't make her small. It made her the foundation of someone who would one day change how we fly, how we lead, how we see. The audience stood in applause, not the kind that echoes and fades, but the kind that roots itself in your skin. He looked at the faces, black, brown, white, old, young, hopeful, and for the first time he didn't feel like the exception. He felt like the future. And somewhere inside that feeling came peace. That night, long after the applause had quieted and the cameras had turned off, Marcus returned alone to the first hangar where it all began. The lights hummed faintly overhead. The tarmac stretched out before him like a scar in concrete. Witness to the moment he'd been mocked, doubted, dismissed. He stood there, hands in his pockets, letting the silence speak, not out of nostalgia, but reverence. This was the ground where he chose not to shrink, where he answered derision not with anger, but with excellence. A security guard walked by, hesitated, then nodded respectfully. "Evening, Mr. Jennings," the guard said. "Evening," Marcus replied with a soft smile. 5 years ago, that same man hadn't looked twice. Now he called him sir. That's how change happens, not always in thunder, but in tone. A few feet away sat the very toolbox he'd brought that morning, red, dented, stubborn as hell. He hadn't used it in months. It was no longer necessary, but he kept it there anyway. As a reminder, as an anchor, he crouched beside it, opened it slowly. Inside were tools worn with time handles, wrapped in tape bits, dulled by precision. But underneath the wrenches and screwdrivers lay something else, a single folded blueprint, the original G7 sketch, his handwriting, his initials. He unfolded it, held it in both hands, and for the first time he didn't feel bitter. He felt whole, because he had taken the very thing meant to erase him and used it to etch himself into history. The doors behind him opened. Alexandra's voice called gently, "You're still here." He turned, smiling. "Just saying goodbye." "To what?" "To the man I was when I first walked in here." She stepped forward, stood beside him. "You know," she said softly, "when I first saw you on this runway, I didn't see a mechanic. I saw someone no one else was seeing." He looked at her. "Why didn't you say anything then?" "Because you didn't need words," she replied. "You needed space. And maybe I needed courage." They stood in silence, letting the weight of everything they'd endured settle between them. Then Alexandra reached into her coat and handed him a small envelope. "What's this?" Marcus asked. "Final documents from the board. They voted unanimously." He opened it, read, and blinked. "Chairman," he said aloud. She nodded, unanimously. Marcus laughed under his breath, disbelieving but no longer surprised. From janitor's son to chairman of the board. That's going to mess up a few business textbooks. Alexandra smirked. Let them rewrite them. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the toolbox right beside the blueprint. Then he closed it, stood up, and together they walked out of the hangar, no longer outliers, no longer fighting for permission. They were the blueprint now, and the runway behind them wasn't just concrete, it was legacy. The world changed not because Marcus Jennings became a symbol of justice, but because he refused to let justice be symbolic. At the next Global Aerospace Summit, he stood not as a guest speaker, but as keynote, the first black chairman to ever open the event. His message was clear. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't angry, it was surgical. Innovation without equity is theft in slow motion, and talent without access is brilliance buried alive. Heads of companies, government officials, and future engineers all listened in silence, not because of his title, but because of the weight behind his words. The Evans aerospace case had become a landmark. Universities taught it, HR departments cited it, and policymakers used it to draft the Ethical Attribution Act, a federal bill aimed at preventing corporate intellectual theft, now informally referred to as the Jennings Clause. But Marcus didn't celebrate the fame. He redirected the spotlight over and over again. Each time a reporter asked about his hero's journey, he pointed to the team at the community center. To Sophia Chun, who had the courage to confront legal silence. To Alexandra, who weaponized her privilege to destroy the very system that had once served her. And always to his mother, because in every corner of the Innovation Center, her story was immortalized not in plaques or portraits, but in access, in opportunity. At a celebration dinner, one of Marcus's students stood up to speak. She was 16, shy, nervous, but her voice carried weight far beyond her age. "My dad told me people like us don't get seats at tables like this," she said. "But Mr. Jennings didn't just give me a seat, he helped me build the table. There wasn't a dry eye in the room." Marcus rose slowly, then walked toward her. He took off the gold lapel pin given to every Evans Aerospace executive and placed it in her hand. "It's yours now," he said. "Just promise me one thing. When it's time, pass it to someone who needs to be reminded that they belong." In that moment, it was clear Marcus Jennings had not just rewritten a legacy. He had planted 1,000 more. If this story moved you, if it stirred something in your heart, made you see a part of the world differently, or reminded you of someone you believe in, then don't let it end here. Share it, talk about it, challenge the silence around you, because sometimes all it takes to change the world is one person who refuses to disappear. Subscribe to Century Stories, and join us for the next truth worth telling.